I have had many introductions since this book came out in 2002. That was the best introduction ever. And I talk a lot, so I'm setting my own timer so that I can cover everything that Dominic wanted me to cover. Dominic and Anna, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. And my first question is, aside from what Terry just said or before this morning, how many of you have heard about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire? How many of you ever heard about the Cherry Mine disaster? Oh, it almost looks like a little more than the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that happened in March of 1911 happened in New York, where seamstresses who were Italian and Jewish were trapped because they locked the doors so that they couldn't take breaks, etc. And that, because of it happening in New York, happening in a populous place, and where there is a concentration of universities and professors of Italian American background, receives a lot of publicity. And it hurts my heart a little bit that the coal miners in this tragic event that happened 2 years before that does not have the wide range of education or knowledge. Many times my husband and I have met people from Illinois and talked about, I wrote the book and never heard about it. I heard about it as a little girl. My grandfather died before John Tintori, who missed work that day. We lived downstairs from my grandmother, his widow, and I remember her clearly. We moved from that house at 8 years old, so I was under 8, and she was standing on the staircase to her upper flat, and she would say to me, "Your grandfather survived the Cherry Mine disaster," and it was like, "Your grandfather walked on water." So this was a refrain I heard often in my life. As an adult, when I began doing genealogical research, lost my timer. That was the first ancestor that I decided to look for. So I wrote to the Bureau of Mines, I wrote to the mayor of Cherry, and I got the pieces of the puzzle out of order. And I was actually sitting in the movie theater Titanic, watching Titanic, when said, "You're sitting on Titanic in a coal mine." And as Terry said, using the journalists, in writing this, Truman Capote invented narrative nonfiction within cold blood. So I studied narrative nonfiction because I also write novels and nonfiction, but these two books from my family history are narrative nonfiction. So I say I use my journalist head and my novelist heart to set the scene, to make this come alive and not just be a straight newspaper story. So in 1904, the St. Paul Mine Company sent some engineers to Northern Illinois, and they struck upon a gold mine of coal. Cherry was the northernmost coal field in Illinois, and there was so much coal underground. Most mining, the miners would work in the winter months, and in summer there was no work. They found the first vein is always very small and there's not much to mine. The second vein was 300 feet below ground. Third vein was 500 feet below ground. And they figured that there was enough coal and they were going to use it to steam was the main source of fuels for the mine, for the railroad. And they were going to use the mine to fuel their buildings and their steam engines and to fuel the railroad. And they figured that there was enough coal under Cherry to mine for 50 years without running short and to work year round, that they could do 8 hours a day year round. So the call went out not only to Seatonville and to Ladd and to Spring Valley. My grandfather actually received his mining certificate from Spring Valley, but miners came from Wales, from Belgium, from Austria, from a number of countries, but the most of them came from the Apennine Hills in Modena. My grandfather came from Fanano, and they were impoverished, and he had followed some other relatives who were already working in Cherry. And it turns out, I found out many, many years after I wrote the book, that my grandfather arrived in New York October 3rd of 1909. The disaster happened November 13th. So if you figure by the time, and he spoke only Italian, and he was coming to his father's sister, Beatrice Tintori Galletti was his father's sister. And he was going to be living with them. And you figure he processes through Ellis Island, however long it takes you in 1909 to get from New York to Chicago. He was a new guy in town. And as I'm writing the book, my dad was dead by that time. On the cover of the book are Corsinis and Galettis, who are cousins of my dad. And Lester Corsini, my dad's cousin, was the first person I interviewed in Detroit, from Detroit. The family left the coal mines to go work in the auto plants in Detroit when Henry Ford was paying $5 a day. So that's how I didn't end up living here, though my dad was born in Kincaid, and the family emigrated to the Chicago area. So 90 miles southwest of here is Cherry. They still have about 500 families as they had back then. And so that fateful Saturday, 3 weeks before, the wiring that they used to electricity throughout the mine, it was declared similar to the Titanic. The mine was declared fireproof. It was one of the first mines in the United States that was outfitted with electricity. And the tipple that they built, which was outside, was declared fireproof. And 3 weeks before the disaster, they kept mules in the bottom of the mine to carry the coal carts back and forth to the elevator shafts. And 3 weeks before the disaster, there was dampness, shorted out the wiring. They ordered the wiring, it didn't come. And so while they were waiting for the wiring, they went back to the old-fashioned way of lighting the tunnels in the mine, which were kerosene torches that they stuck along the timbers to light the main paths. So you've got 300 feet below ground men working 500 feet below ground. There was a main elevator shaft that dropped the men down to the second vein. And then the guys who worked in the third vein walked 300 feet across, and then it was a combination wooden staircase ladder that went down to the bottom vein, which is where the mules were kept. And lunchtime that day, some men left, and they had noticed the fire, but said at that point they could have put it out with their coats. What happened was the men came to work at 7 o'clock in the morning. Every day they dropped down 6 bales of hay to feed the mules. Mules never left the mine. If a mule got sick and left the mine and they cured it and tried to send it back down, the mules went insane trying to go back down. The hay came down just as coal was coming up. Coal was king. So the 3 kids, they were 19, 22, pushed aside the hay cart underneath a kerosene torch so that the coal could go up. Now, I've been told you can stick a blowtorch to cut hay and it will not burn. So the theory was, and nobody ever really proved why the fire started, the theory was that kerosene dripped from the torch into the hay and was an accelerant that started the fire. So the kids panicked, they got pails of water, they're throwing pails of water at it, and they're not squenching the fire. They eventually pushed the hay cart to the shaft and dropped it down into the third vein where there was a pump and where they had water for the mules, and they finally got it put out. But coal is under shale in the ground, and the shale is where you hear about mine collapses because it's soft and it crumbles. So they use timbers, wooden timbers, to shore up the roofs of the mine. Well, by the time the hay was in the basement and being put out, the mine timbers were all on fire. The call to abandon the mine didn't go out for 45 minutes. Now you have a town where there are German farmers who are on the prairie as this town is blossoming with immigrants. They don't want to go work down in the coal mine, yet they're resentful of the immigrants who come to town because they're earning more money than the farmers working in the coal mine. And you've got a town where neighbors, there's a cacophony of languages going on, and people can't communicate with each other except by gestures. The greatest number of miners that were in the mine of the population in Cherry that time were Slavs and Italians, with Italians being the primary ones. And so there was the call to abandon the mine. They're yelling in English, the mine's on fire. Well, the miners are smelling smoke and they're, like, okay, they'll put it out. They were used to little fires every now and then. They thought it would be put out. And so eventually the fire is like smoke is coming out of the mine. Johnny Galetti's younger brother is running through town like Paul Revere, screaming that the mine is on fire. The townspeople come, and there is that one cage that goes down. There had been a second cage that had been built on the third vein. It had been tried out and connected, but it had never been used. That could have saved some of the men on the bottom. So by the time that everything is on fire, at that time, the closest people were in Southern Illinois, the mine rescue station, and in Pennsylvania. So word goes out to these mine rescue people very far away to come and help. The townspeople are all gathered, the smoke is coming out, and very few people were coming up on the cage. So they said, we need to go down. So you've got farmers, you've got people who are running the different stores in town, going down into the mine trying to rescue people. They'd never been in a mine before in their lives. Very few people were near the cage and got pulled up. By the time the miners realized what was going on, it was pandemonium down there. As the fire is spreading, the mules were going crazy, the men were going crazy. They were fighting each other to get on the cage to get out. A rescue squad of townspeople went down. They went down 6 times, and they grabbed a few people that they found nearby. But now you've got smoke, you've got the gases that are going down there, black damp and white damp, that are poisoning men. They're going back into the mines looking for pockets of good air, figuring, oh, they'll put out the fire and then we'll get out of here later. Then the 7th trip down, there was the guy who was running the hoist had signals. And they said, okay, you're going to clang 3 times or 4, there's a pattern of signals where he would raise them up. Well, because they were all engulfed in flames, there was a confusion of the signals, and people are in the hoisting room screaming at him, pull them up, pull them up. Well, he had mine laws to follow, and he was afraid of, and he did get in trouble for disobeying the mine laws. But finally they're screaming at him, they're all probably going to die down there, pull them up. And the townspeople are there, and here comes the cage with all of them burnt to death on the cage. So then they say, okay, we're gonna get the smoke out of the mine, we're gonna reverse the fans and pull the smoke from the mine. And they pulled the fire right out of the mine, and it burned down the fan house. So you can imagine these immigrant families that are standing there. The book goes back and forth between what's going on above ground and what's going on below ground. You've got the New York Times and every major newspaper is covering this story. The mine company finally decides the only way to put out the fire is to seal the 2 shafts. And so everybody's watching, their families, whoever's not out of the mine is getting sealed alive. And then the geological survey men come, and they occasionally open, like the next day they open the mine and they drop down thermometers. It's 115 degrees in there. They're testing can we breathe? Can we go down there and try to find people? I don't know if any of you remember the Cute Creek flood that happened a number of years ago, and that little yellow capsule that was going down into the mine trying to rescue the miners. At Cherry, it was a half of a whiskey barrel on clothesline was the rescue operation. And there were 2 men. So you got 2 guys side by side, one leg in the whiskey barrel, one leg out, and they lowered them down, and they didn't realize that they weren't of equal weight. So the thing starts tipping, they almost fell down into the burning mine. They brought them up real fast and got 2 comparably sized men to go down there. They kept sealing the mine, and it became a circus event. They set up a circus tent to use as a morgue, but it was like, I want to say that Cherry was the end of the line, because the railroad went to Ladd, and then it just backed up 3 miles to Cherry and then back to Ladd. That was really the end of the line. I like to say they traded daylight for a future, because they went down into the mine in the morning. Think about it, in Italy, in the mountains and the beauty, and they had to leave that because they were in poverty, and then to go to work in complete darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. So while this is going on, the men are going back and back into the mine looking for pockets of air so that they can breathe. And the miners they're taking their lunch boxes and whatever wood they can find, and they're building makeshift fans to try to push the poisonous air away from themselves. there was a group of 20 men who kept going back in the mine, and they wrote letters. They figured we're going to die. And they wrote notes to their families, stuck them in their pockets. And those 20 guys that night, they lay down to die, figuring this is it. And this was on Sunday night. And so this is Saturday, now we're into Sunday night. And in the middle of the night, one of them who was religious got up. It wasn't an Italian guy. He got up, he said, I have an idea. Why don't we dig coal from the floor and from the walls and barricade ourselves in, and then we'll be in a place with good air, and maybe, you know, we'll get out once the fire is out. So two guys, Dominic, I'm going to forget his name, but Antonori Cordaroli, whose family I am now friends with, and Dominic Formentino, they went looking, they went on a search, they found one pickaxe and one shovel. So and then they got the Bugatti brothers and some others, and they worked all night with their bare hands and with the pickaxe and shovel, and they barricaded themselves in. By Tuesday, the miners had the light on their helmets. By Tuesday, that wax, there was no more light. They were in total darkness. They had used up their food in the beginning. They had shared their lunch boxes with each other. So now they're eating the leather from their belts. They're eating the leather from their hats. They're looking for water in the mine. There was some seepage, and there's a passage in there about the fights. They would take turns to go and drink from the water that was seeping up, and it was so vile that they would immediately vomit it back up. Meanwhile, rescue attempts are going on. People come, 25,000 people show up on Sunday to watch, and they set up sandwich stands. It becomes a circus event. And President Taft writes letters of condolences. The Red Cross comes to help. In all, as Terry said, 259 of the 481 men who went down into the mine perished. And it took until February of the next year for the last body to come out, because they kind of got the fire under control by Thursday. So from Saturday to Thursday, it's kind of under control, but it still kept flaring up. And they would open the mine, they would close the mine, they would bring up bodies. And then you've got widows and family trying to identify people in the circus tent that became like a makeshift morgue. The morning of the mine fire, the wiring didn't come, but there was a young man named Sam Howard and his 15-year-old brother who was underage. His mom was an Italian immigrant, and Sam had ordered an engagement ring for his fiance to be that from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And that every morning he went to the post office before work to see if the ring came. That morning the ring came. So as he's dying, they're with pencil stubs and little papers that they had. He's writing, he kept a journal. And you could see as the gas was getting to him and his brother, the pencil going down. And he said, the ring is in my pocket, and if I don't make it, give it to Mamie. He was supposed to propose to her that night and get married on Christmas. The young boys who were in the mine were trappers. So what they would do is the coal cars would come through, they would open the door and let them through and close it up again to keep the ventilation in those areas where the miners were working. So they had the young boys who were in the mine, the families needed the money. They lied on their affidavits about the kids' ages, and the mine company looked the other way because they needed the workers. So of all of the mining laws that were broken, the coal company, there were 3 underage kids who died. The coal company ended up paying a total of $630 for the death of those 3 boys. So in the aftermath, the thing that kills me that this is not more widely known is that in the aftermath of the disaster, mining laws were changed. Child and adult labor laws were changed. The settlement of the mine disaster was based on the 12-year-old workers' comp law that had been passed in Great Britain. And so the attorneys who were working with the families and the mine company regarding the settlement based their settlement on that law. And the following year, Illinois was among the first states in this country to pass a workers' compensation law, which then later became federal law. Because those mine rescue stations were so far away, and those are like fire stations, and you compare them to fire stations at home. They decided they were going to build mine rescue stations closer to mines. So that also changed. And so there was so much historic significance to what happened in this disaster that it's still shocking to me that it's such a well-kept secret and that it's not more widely known. The Italian consul came from Italy, offering free passage back to Italy for any of the widows and children who wanted to go back. All in all, the amount that they paid for these people was pitiful. $1,620 was paid to each widow or to the mother who lost her son. Now, Johnny Galletti, my grandfather's first cousin, was 18. He was already he earned the money for the family because his father died in a mine accident at Braceville. And so his mother spit in the face of the judge and says, I'm not taking that little money for my son's death. And her daughter, Mary, tried to convince her to take the money. She said, I'm not taking it. She was actually jailed and held in contempt of court for not taking the money. On Thursday, November 25th, 1909, it was 3 hours into Thanksgiving Day. That was when the mine was sealed again. And then the last victim wasn't brought up until July of 1910. However, my dad's cousin Mary had convinced her to take the money to build a house for their son, for the rest of the kids, the money from her son's death. The other book that I wrote about, based on my Sicilian American side of the family, is about my great aunt who was a family secret for 80 years. And I kept wondering why I was being stalled about getting information on that side of the family. Well, she was murdered by her older brothers in an honor killing in Detroit. And she's not in the 1920 census. So they came over in 1914, right as women are about to be able to vote, and all the future that was here for her in the United States, that was for my grandmother. She's murdered by her brothers because she eloped with the young man she was in love with, rather than the guy 20 years older who her father had promised her to.
They killed her?
They chopped off her hands, they weighted her down, and she's in the Detroit River off Belle Isle. To this day. And the night they killed her, they erased her from the family passport. They burned all of her clothing, and she was never spoken again except in whispers by her sisters. And my mother overheard this and my aunt for 80 years. All of you who have Italian American stories, even though traditional publishing doesn't consider us other voices and they're looking for other ethnic stories, we have Italian presses who are looking to keep our stories alive. If you have stories in your family, even if you just pass them down to your children, please do. Because as Dominic said, I don't know what, I don't think my kids have read either one of these books. They know the story, but they haven't read it. I mean, maybe after I'm dead, they'll read it. I don't know, maybe my grandchildren will read it. But thank you all, and share the story of this tragedy that happened so close to Illinois.
Thank you.
Thank you.